Good evening, everybody. My name is Andrew Reynolds, and I'm the chairman of City Architecture Forum. I'm delighted to welcome you to our 5th event in the City Architecture Forum Summer Digital Lecture Series. As we continue to try and find a series of eclectic subjects for you, today we've got John Bushell from KPF. John, welcome.
Thank you.
John is going to talk to us about the refurbishment and redevelopment of an old city favourite, the BT HQ in Newgate Street, which I think has been there, what, 35 years, John? Something like that?
Yes.
Maybe even longer?
80s, yeah, so.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. KPF are working on that with Orion Capital Partners and Pella, and I, having seen the design and also kind of listened to the planning committee meeting a couple of weeks ago now, I think you'll all find today's presentation very interesting. It's a fantastic transformation of an existing building rather than a knock down and start again. John's going to talk to us for 20-25 minutes, and then in usual City Architecture Forum tradition, we're going to have Q&A thereafter. So, John, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. So, you see my screen?
Indeed, yeah, that's good.
And in fact, it was very handy to hear Alistair Moss set out his new agenda for the city at, I think, one of your events in the autumn last year.
That was the dinner last year, yeah, that's right.
So it was incredibly useful and timely briefing for us because it was just as we were starting to think about the project. Just very briefly, I'm sure you all know, but KPF London and New York design offices, and we work very closely together. In terms of workplace, we are from London, working mainly in the UK, but also on the continent and in Asia. And our New York colleagues have an office also in San Francisco. So we cover tech people, Facebook, Google, etc., on the West Coast, the southern states, and tech companies and other companies in Asia. So we've got a really good sense of very rapidly changing trends at the moment. We do lots of different types of projects, and you can see on the left is Floral Court in Westminster, on the right, Lime Street. We see these both as actually contextual buildings. They're really responding to both the context architecturally, but so for instance, Lime Street, just next to the Lloyd's building, which became a Grade 1 listed building as we were thinking about it. So common to our projects is really trying to make a imaginative and complex urbanity that is very responsive to its context. And that can be at any scale. So we do actually do quite small scale projects as well as towers. And we absolutely love transformation projects. So this is just a grid, but we have a large portfolio of, and we really enjoy the imaginative, we call them transformations, not refurbishments, to give a building another lease of life, a whole nother generation of life. So they're quite robust. I remember when we won the Unilever project, I asked Stanhope why, because I was, just make sure we were appointed first, and said they really liked our analytical process, and that we don't, we come to a conclusion through carefully thought process. So just to illustrate that, this is the World Bank in DC, which we did in the early 90s. We're the only architect to present a reuse scheme because in Washington, DC, there's a fix to the heights. But this is very relevant to 81 Newgate Street because it's got quite a tight floor to floor. And through this, we learned all about how if you didn't have enough for deep ducts horizontally, you made more zones. So we, from the beginning, knew that if say this is probably 3 tenancies, 3 zones, we actually have 6 zones in MEP. And so all the horizontal ductwork is minimized and we have more risers. And that was a helpful thing to start from the very beginning. In terms of children of the 70s and 80s, we like them a lot. This is South Bank Tower. The frames are extremely well built. The concrete gets harder over time from when it's finished. So they're very robust buildings fundamentally to use. Unilever, again, a kind of transformation where we try to reinvent what people might have done if they'd had more freedom at the time. And again, we're trying to make the 81 Newgate Street a better version of what it actually was. So we quite like that era. Just so you know, in Manhattan, there are a huge number of transformation projects occurring at the moment, and we're doing a lot of them. Huge projects. The two biggest components, other than the obvious of the new systems and maybe envelope, is that there's some interesting structural interventions, again, to make buildings that typically have quite a tight floor to floor, have voids and volumes and special spaces, which we do at 81 Newgate Street. And key is also, how do you reposition everything to do with the lobbies, the interaction of buildings that didn't have active ground floors with their urban block. On the right hand, 660 Fifth Avenue. There we're discovering actually that there's a very fragile slab edge. We had to span column to column. That almost taking aluminium out of the curtain wall system was a hugely useful thing to do in terms of the performance of the glazing. So that we've got glass that's shaded, and then we're cutting down the aluminium and the weaknesses in the curtain wall system as much as possible, or covering them. And repositioning some of our own buildings as well, key, the lobby, and then a very work person-like transformation of the buildings. Even in Brooklyn, bottom left, very unpromising start, another child of the 70s, and a shed on the right. So we really enjoy it. And for us, it's about imagination and coming up with something different. This is very contextual for LA, but it's again a transformation. It was a shed. This is a car museum. And Jean always jokes that if you look around at this junction, everything else is the same. We love roof gardens. I did my 5th year dissertation on roof gardens, and we always try and ban the MEP engineers from our roofs. And Thames Court, which was a little while ago now, the first project that KPF project I worked on, but it did introduce us to the St. Paul's grid. And there's not a millimetre of space between, just a millimetre in this project between the building and St. Paul's grid. And that was useful in terms of an insight when we started this project. So interesting building, very robustly built, a very big lump. And the idea is to really make it more open, internal to exterior, to make terraces, and to completely reduce its overbearing character while making a bigger building. You can see here that we voluntarily took away some of the existing building. It was built by the PSA and did not comply with St. Paul's heights and grids. And from the very beginning, when we were talking to Orion and Pella, we said, you know, we have to take some building away here before we can start figuring out what we do next. And that will be a good start also in discussions with the city. And effectively, that's what we did. So the building is a linchpin where at the moment it's totally closed on a gyratory, yet just close to St. Paul's and to the cultural district and at the end of Cheapside. So the city wanted this building to completely transform too. And it began to get a kind of a list of all the things that they wanted on the site, and we've been able to do all of those. So GPO to BT, a slightly curious building. It had very, very large atriums in the middle, lot of basement space, lots of tunnels underneath it, so we didn't want to do very much in the basements at all. And then nascently in the plan, you can see here a combination of atriums, but also slots or gaps to the outside. Very lean in terms of is quite an efficient building, dispersed cores, lots of columns. So from the beginning, we suggested it was a refurbishment. We didn't win the first round of bids on this, and it was when the new build option fell away that I think that the next set were actually on refurbishments. And we looked at a very, very basic one or a transformational refurbishment. And you can see from the very beginning on the right-hand side that we knew we wanted to take space away to make the building comply more with responding to its setting. So here, bottom right, you can see the St. Paul's grids going across the corner of the building. Settings of St. Paul's, lots and lots of views, a very large number of view studies. We do all of the first take of those ourselves. We have a full London model, etc. And so the story evolved about how could we add area in some places, take it away in others, but really completely transform the character, the association and the image of the building from this very big, lumpy, quite bunker-like thing to something that was utterly different. And in taking away the sort of the western face of the building for views of St. Paul's, it allowed us to completely remodel the most visible and important facade in many ways. And you can see we began to look at how could we actually have lower, mid and bigger elements to really change the cliff-like nature of the building at the moment, to bring almost a story of the gardens of Christchurch to steps and terraces up our building and to a big roof garden at the top. And so the taking away of space and the ability to remodel just the front surfaces seemed to be a really good synergy and starting point. We try and be very analytical, and this goes through a process of where are the cores, where are the holes. We have a few rules that we've learned painfully over time, that you can't put new cores where there's current floor slabs, you know, they have to be in the holes that exist at the moment. So we're very, very, very self-regulating and disciplined. But we've also learned that if you rely on old components, they quite often fail, or you find later that they're not quite as good as you thought they would. So key systems like lifts, etc., we provide new housing, new risers to reduce the effect of finding anything that we didn't know at the beginning. And the bottom right is where we got to. So the beginnings of those indents become slots of atria that bring it, that light in from the side. And the atria is infilled as a mixture of core and floor plate. This looks in detail at how actually complying with the grid was not too painful. We did many, many views of this. You can see there's a dotted line here, which is a set out, which from the very, very furthest northern point of King Edward Street, there is no difference in how much we saw here or here because of the building that's just beyond us. And anything we added was outside of the St. Paul's policy area, and anything within that was either reduced exceedance or actually now compliance. And so you get on the left-hand side a bunker-like thing. On the right-hand side, we changed to a double height reading to transform the scale. We removed the area in front of the red line inside the policy line. You can see it makes a really big difference to opening up a new vista of St. Paul's. And perhaps the space that we lost there, we added on to the northern end of the site primarily, but we added back and away and stepped back so that it wasn't really very visible from any streetscape. So that is then where we get to the existing building and a modern interpretation, or something that looks like very familiar to that, but allows us to create many terraces. So we knew the city wanted a carbon agenda, and this is very good on that in both recycling embodied and in emissions. A wellness agenda, so there are openable windows every 3 meters throughout the entire perimeter of this, and ventilation in the middle of the building. Urban greening, so we have very strong views on that. We believe that terraces are better than green walls, lots of different reasons, but they mean they're also an amenity for people who are in the building. They're easy to maintain and get at, and they can be substantive in terms of what is grown there. But more importantly, also, for instance, in Singapore, that really encourage green, you can only put 10% of vertical greening into your calculations to comply with their regulations. In Hong Kong and various other cities, it can only be within 10 meters of the ground plane, because they've learned there are lots of drawbacks to difficult to access and large vertical green walls. So probably the only long debate we had with the planners was to stick to all horizontal surfaces, just a little bit around the base of the building, but transforming it, giving ourselves the rule that every floor should have some really nice terraces to get to. We used the existing building as a quarry to put stone onto the new portions of the building. It allowed us to remove every other spandrel. We've practiced doing that, and again, it's in extremely good shape. and then adding on a terracotta spandrel in between, which we think is the least energy carbon usage solid new material to put onto the building, and transform the openness of the building while not needing a single piece of new stone to be quarried for it, and also to make it still feel at home in its very close proximity to St. Paul's. So from the left, quite closed, and the repetitiveness of the every floor, to the right, opening up the module, it really helps adjust your sense of the scale of the building, and open the building up somewhat, sensitive to each elevation in terms of the exact amount of solid and shading, etc. So we worked around the building on this thesis that we would open up the building, the floor plates. We would have a very similar articulation to before, but on these bigger readings. And we would try and add a little bit to the top of the building to replace what we had taken off to the side, but always judged very carefully with the city, looking view by view, and always stepping back so you can see the added on floor up here. You can barely see. This is filling out where the skylights are at the moment. There was, however, other than Townscape, a very hard stop, which is the Millennium Bridge view and all the way along the South Bank. So we've tracked from Blackfriars Bridge to Southwark Bridge to make sure that nothing was happening. And so if you take here the diagonal of the grid and also the Millennium Bridge plane, very, very few places where the core could go. So that more or less solved itself, that, you know, where can we put the core that's still in an atrium and where the lift overruns don't kind of create a problem from any views anywhere. So after having gone through that sort of massing architecture discussion with the city, their big next concerns were to make sure that it worked very hard at the base of the building and the top of the building. So at the base of the building, there are two diagrams around in the city guidance of a cultural route. One is Tate St. Paul's, and then to the roundabout where the concert hall will be, and the other goes through to where the museum will be. And it's hard to say which, or maybe they're both important. And in fact, the network we subscribe to as an idea. So we have a route through the middle of our building that connects these two, creates the destination, creates a spot to go to with an art installation, but also somehow begins to help our building really respond well to the Christ Church and the gardens to the west, and make quite an interesting link between those two routes. So that becomes a public route and an arcade with retail along one side, the main entrance to the building in there, an art wall, and something then that is open long hours. There is a quirk of the site, which is the pavements don't align with the ground floor all the way around the perimeter. And we could very gently ramp the few 100 mil down so that there's very clear ways to get into the building from the route through. We did many versions of this for the city. We showed them how, if it wasn't the dream of one big unit, it could be subdivided into 2 or 3 or 5. But here is the generous route through the building, and we'll curate a really interesting installation there. We hope it's almost the place where there'll be events. We're hoping to get one big food offer, but clearly that may change over time, and the city are very understanding of that. So as we cut a section east-west through the building, we have the route through, the entrance as part of the reason why that route was always busy, atriums that then create also more terrace space within the building, and stepping back away from the streetscape on all sides. The atriums work really beautifully to locate the office space to place, so the right-hand side looking south to St. Paul's, and you get that view actually from the first floor. You can just begin to see over the roof, so extremely good view. And then from looking to the west, all the way through the atrium. So the atrium has an uneven stack, and there's terraces, an accessible terrace on every floor. And then one looking directly at the center of the city cluster to the east. So the inside comes into the building, the inside-outside links are very strong. There's some cafe spill-out space now where the steps are. So it creates a place that one can dwell in, and a very, very active ground floor, which means the office lobbies are lifted to the first floor. So the escalators take, so the entire ground floor is about the place, which is the end of Cheapside. Our clients joined the Cheapside bid, and the office takes from the first floor up. Now we're finding the same thing happening in many cities across the world, where the importance of the informal space and the space you can just pop to from your office is valued. This is north-south, so the loading bay is kept where it is. You can see that the core and various things are at the back of the building, at the north of the building, and then a big roof garden. And here's the atrium to the south, stepping back, and all of this space with great views to St. Paul's. So to set up a beautiful roof garden, we stack all of the cooling over a number of floors, and we do this typically. So Unilever, all the chillers are stacked in one corner. South Bank Tower, I mean, any project that we do, we don't spread the plant out across the building. And that maximizes the roof for other things. We did try and see whether we could paint those yellow and have a expressed cooling towers. Was one step too far. But that sets up, and you can see the composition of the north just as much discussed. Sets up a fantastic roof garden landscape with the whole of this publicly accessible. So not only is the base open, but the top is open, and this helps us, I think, really say to Alistair's agenda that we've tried to respond to every one of them. Part of it is dedicated to the office here that looks towards the city, but this is all publicly accessible. But the tenants have fantastic terraces in other places, so there's lots of interaction for them too. And there's a restaurant at the back here. So we developed this in a very detailed way with Tom Stewart Smith, and we wanted this to feel like a landscape that flowed. There is an entire area of biodiversible meadow, Tom calls it, here, which is so that we're not just terraces and places to sit. The office here, people here. And if the building, even though it's built in the 80s, is essentially a 70s building, we try to bring in not exactly Carlo Scarpa, but a kind of feel of a 70s landscape of different levels, of lots of more intimate spaces, of steps and changes that you could imagine them being occupied. So these informal steps have the most amazing view on access to St. Paul's. And this area here helps deal a little bit with the management of guests and people arriving. And there's a lift here just to the side. So truly phenomenal views all the way around, with a good likelihood they'll all stay as they are. So the urban greening factor, again, a big priority. We got to 0.377. I think the GLA are now encouraging 0.4, which I would see as quite a formidable challenge. But we have got to that, and I'm sure you all know, but real trees really help. So we've introduced a lot of trees around the perimeter of the building, which are part of a good diverse story. Very carefully policed by the city about the depth and size of the planters to make sure that they were very generous, and good scrutiny of the sizes and the types of things that could flourish there. We've kept all of the basement, put as much plant as possible in there. There's a tiny extension to the basement just here. That allows us to put a state-of-the-art swimming pool in for the office tenants and people on the lower level. But we always try and put all the cycles as close to the underside of the ground floor as possible. And then they have ramped access in here, so it's very clean. And then the cycles and showers and lockers are totally separate from the gym. So it's a very robust in terms of tenants asking if things can be dedicated to them or not. We've had long discussions about where we are extending, what material can we use. The team on this, AKT, are doing the structures, Hilson around with MEP, and lots and lots of debate, Arup Fire, to make sure we quite like a group of disparate people, because there's a lot of debate and self-correction that happens within the team in that way. We don't think we can do a timber extension to this. We were trying very hard to, but the size of the compartments, fire load, etc., was very difficult. But so we're still searching for the best embodied carbon answer to that. So this diagrammatically shows the plant stacked at the back of the building on the top, but a large amount in the basement. We used the soffit of the loading bay. There's a lot of air exhaust and intake around the north face of the building too. Giving the ground floor as retail use and retail at the top of the building, so there's quite a lot about making sure all of that serviced with the proper riser requirements. A deep regret of mine is we didn't put enough retail risers in Mid-City Place, so there's not a pub there. And then we'll use the atriums as exhaust plenums where we need, although we're probably taking all the air down to get a heat recovery in the base of the building, but that's work in progress. Arif Langham from Orion used to be a structural engineer, and so very first take, it's got too many columns, and we spent a long time trying to find out how we can deal with that. On the Unilever project, we worked out that to change one column cost £1 million, so we never changed a single one. On this, slightly different discipline, so the too many columns is mostly where there are pairs of columns which anticipated a sort of space planning regime. And Albert from AKT has come up with a progressive idea where we put big plates on the soffits to carry the two above, put in one, go up, do the same. So we get to the point where we have a single column and a large plate where the pair used to be all the way up the building in that one column line. We're leaving the rest alone. And clearly, obviously, when we put new cores in, we can enhance the rigidity of the building again. But the diagram on to the left shows not that much in terms of taking structure out. We have made a kind of slot all the way around the ground floor to bring light in and to create a more interesting, generous ability to open up the ground floor. So I should say we did this quite quickly. We started in September last year. We got our approval in June. So this application was put together in remote working, and in fact, the final meetings with the city were, and all of the preparation of report and the committee. And so here, this just shows that the floor plates range in size. I mean, they're 40,000 plus at the bottom. They can be divided into three, but they are, the loading bay at the bottom and the plant at the top. They have interruption to the north, and you can see the effect of the setting back for St Paul's Heights. So this was the scheme we submitted for planning and have approval. We have, and there's a whole set of wellness and carbon agendas that we can come back to. As submitted, we were just over 50% below the carbon emissions required by Part L, so healthily more than 35% reduction that's required. However, that isn't strictly relevant because it's the operational carbon that's important. And we've set ourselves a target of seeing how far we can get to the Paris Agreement levels of operational carbon. And obviously that starts to need further changes to systems, more reliance on the natural ventilation story, and we're working through that at the moment. And as part of that, we're also rearranging the center of the building a little bit. So we've rotated the core and looked more closely at that after we've really fully understood some aspects of the structure internally. And that's allowed us to put the core almost in the perfect space for the deep space in the building. So there's a sort of typically sort of 13.5 nominal core to wall here, a little bit more here, but you can see that it's mainly a racetrack, and we're now just tweaking that kind of interaction of the atrium slots to get to the point where we have the best amount of linear offices for tenants. And just to kind of to end on what next in terms of the wider context, we do know that the city have some aspirations to improve the public realm in this area because of the key connections of St Paul's to museum and to concert hall. The version that, I mean, and I think each part of the city may have different views on which may be the best. One of them is to pedestrianise King Edward Street, which this illustrates. And if that were the case, it would make an amazing new public space or square very close to St Paul's, who do feel that as more and more buildings, offices come near them, that their own churchyard gardens are to capacity. So we are hopeful that this has a good hearing in terms of a beautiful space, larger than Paternoster Square. And there's a quirk that the old GPO building, actually the site ownership goes all the way across the road here. So Ryan and Pella can be very helpful in helping this happen in terms of ownership and doing the work, etc. So we would love this to happen. There are some discussions, and this makes Cheapside Newgate a normal two-way road, and the new square. There are equally a lobby for we believe St Martin's and for Angel Street, and lots of different permutations. So we'll allow that to unfold. Clearly, we have great Crossrail accessibility from the Barbican to the north in any case, so we're very aware that the St Paul's Tube Station one day will not be the only address. So I suppose in summary, we hope that this is a really good example of how much one can transform a building to feel as new, to answer the city agenda of please be more inclusive at the base and the top of the building, have ambition about urban greening, have ambition about carbon, and we have had some really good tenant interest so far. We were always very keen to make sure it looked good from the St Paul's Gallery and from many different angles. And I think this will be a really good new life for a building. And it's been very satisfying to be able to keep more than the frame, but also some of the other more precious materials there. So hopefully that allows lots of time for questions.
Thank you, John. That was brilliant. I must remember not to use refurbishment, but transformation. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
First question, if I may. You talked about the city's shopping list. Obviously, we know they're quite dictatorial at the best of times, but did you give them everything that was on their shopping list when you started, do you think? Without giving away any trade secrets?
Both Pella and Orion want to do the best reasonable building. So they set, the stall was never set out to fight anything that the city felt was important, but just to make sure we were honing, negotiating, and making sure it was relevant to us too. So, and we made that strategic decision that we would go to them from the beginning saying, we will try, we'll comply with St Paul's Heights as far as we can. So we were quite proactive in saying that we did sympathise and want to embrace their agenda. Orion from the very beginning wanted a public face to the building. They were very enthused at that at the beginning about that. So there were no resistance or fights. The city, I guess, kept us honest about, if we had said we were going to comply with St Paul's Heights and allow people on the roof, they really made sure that we did it. But I think we are very happy with the balance we got to. So, for instance, we do have some dedicated office space and a restaurant and some public space. So we think that in responding to their agenda, it puts this as a building that is actually, because their agenda is very similar to a forward-looking tenants agenda. So I would say with negotiation, we hope that this ticks all their boxes, but that is effectively what our clients wanted to do. Because they felt, for instance, Orion, when they came back from their travels, they would have gone to see buildings with public roof gardens and open bases and things. So it was really doing that agenda in a way in which we wanted to do.
Great. Okay. A few questions coming in, but please keep sending them in. First one is from David Magyar, John Robertson. His comment was a very impressive presentation, thank you. No doubt the client played a huge part in enabling you to think freely. what can you tell us about them and how they worked with you to bring about such an outstanding scheme? I think you've led a little bit there with Araf, but obviously with Nick and George as well.
Yeah, I mean, we always say that architects can only do a good building if we have a good client. We believe that completely. So the two components, George Kyriakou, KPF have known since the mid-1990s. We did Thames Court together, and other schemes, other projects. South Bank Tower we did with George, and Nick Boehmer, his partner, and they have a fantastic way of only dealing what's important at each time. So for instance, we don't have design team meetings with 50 people when we haven't got the basic thinking right, and people are brought in when it becomes sensible. So that allows you to be much more agile, because it's not 15 people who have to change their drawings, it's just one or two.
Yeah.
And so they have an extremely clear view of process. Orion were hugely enthusiastic about doing a building they were proud of, that was doing the right thing, but also because they felt that was the best way of making sure that the building would let. So I think both organisations were quite intense, that you get very senior people involved. There's no middle management in either of them, and we reciprocated. So it was that very focused. I think good architects with one or two other people are self-correcting at the beginning of schemes. You don't need to if you get the basic things in place, it then is easier for other people to join in progressively. We do have a little bit of a formula. I mean, we bring people like Miller Hare or their equivalent in very early on. We use Chris Mealy a lot in terms of heritage advice, etc. So we do try and we always we always disclose the worst cases at the beginning with the planners. So we don't kind of everything's fine and then suddenly, oh my God. So we try and make sure that it starts on a footing of these are the opportunities, these are the problems, and together, what's the best we can make of it, step by step.
Is there anything you didn't get that you wanted or your clients wanted? I mean, wishful thinking aside.
I mean, I think it took them a while to really embrace the idea there were the public on the roof, but I think that's got to a point where they understand that it's a good thing. We had to spend a long time making sure that could happen without prejudicing any overlooking to any of the tenant terraces, etc. So it's taken quite a long time to configure it such that the public being in the building won't discourage any of the tenants.
Right.
So those have been one of the more complicated things. We did well in terms of our increase in areas. I think it's a good negotiated place to get to.
They're a happy team and a happy client.
We're a very happy team. Yeah, I think so.
Good. Question from Richard Saxon. The techie ones are coming in now. John, the plan depths are still dependent on artificial ventilation. How does the mixture of AC and opening windows work? The curve.
It's a good one. So it's quite related to what the tenant fit out is. So there's a more open plan and there's a more cellular version. So the cellular version is easier. That the whole of the perimeter is more or less cellularized and they are ventilated from the perimeter. We see lift shafts as also light shafts. So while a very big atrium in the middle of the building is struggling to get light down to the building and is using a lot of area, the idea of a light and ventilation shaft that's a smaller object, and maybe that also is the lift shaft. So the lift shafts for us is also something that is not closed with a closed lift. So from Thames Court on, there has been kind of more light on they've got glass fronts and things. So there's the provision to ventilate from the center of the building, but not through a big core, but through small slots that are strategically located. That's not going to work though if it's all cellularized, because the drag going over the doors and grills is too much to make it a natural system. So we get much better carbon savings for open plan. it's then only a portion of the building if it's cellular. And what we're hoping is to have discussions with the tenant about where strategically, and if they want to share in collectively, the landlord and the tenant getting to the best answer in terms of carbon, that they select the communal spaces and the openal spaces that help the cross ventilation story. If not, then we do have less of a carbon saving. Even in Thames Court, however, we had openable windows, and there's a micro switch, and the air conditioning switched off in every room where a window's opened.
Right.
So even back then, we liked the kind of mixed mode, and it's partly local control. It's partly going to be how far we can go with the fit out.
Okay. We haven't mentioned the dreaded word, but COVID, how do you see the building responding to that? And obviously, you know, you've got transformation rather than bright, shiny. What's the team's twist on that? How are you telling these pre-let tenants that this is a new shiny building behind the stone that you've kind of cleverly reused?
So obviously we've got quite a few active office projects, and we've got a COVID list for each one. And there's a different one for the States and from here and for China, but obviously we're trying to collect them. But I think at its most basic, the COVID, one aspect of it is massively accelerating anything to do with wellness, fresh air, local plants, openable windows, big roof gardens, big terraces, the connection between inside and out. So even we have a number of projects in China where they're introducing natural ventilation and much more communal external spaces. So there's one aspect of it which is about air quality, not using the air more than once, etc. On the other hand, lifts, certainly in the States, we're putting extract on the top of all the lifts so that the air is taken out of the lift, brought in at the base, all the touchless stuff, all of the controls. So if you think in the East that's enough because there's such a consensus about wearing masks and monitoring temperature and etc., in the States, it may not yet be enough because there's a kind of an extra layer of behavioral free will, if you like, and therefore more space, more diversity, a lot more about what's the critical path, you know, is it the fire escape stair or what is it? And that limits occupancy a little bit. So here, certainly with this project, we're working through that, but there's, in terms of air quality, external space, touchless technology, etc., there are all of the right things there. In terms of talking to the tenants about not being so sure about what they want, and therefore, for this building does have a high and a low rise lift. Instead of having one crossover floor, we've overlapped the lift cores by 3 floors. So there's a lot more flexibility about, you know, one anchor tenant has a lot more delta in the size they are, with maybe other smaller tenants following through. So we've tried to build some fundamental flexibility into the building. To deal with the issue that a tenant doesn't know in 3 years' time if they're going to be exactly a particular thing. It's now more plus or minus quite a big thing. It's accentuated how easy is it to subdivide, etc. So, I mean, those are levels where you can still say, and we still believe that the office has purpose, has the purpose of collective endeavour, and that we're trying to make sure, and therefore should facilitate big meetings, informal meetings, etc., etc. And so we're following all of that through with the plant specs and the amount of plant that we're making available.
And will you be shell and core?
That all depends. We sometimes do the interiors of our own buildings. We don't do interiors outside of that. It entirely depends. Some of them we've done ourselves. Some of we're very happy if other people come with the tenant and they would prefer that. We're very open to that.
Okay, great. A couple more questions, John. Martha Grekos, wonderful, John, exclamation mark. Then the question. With many office buildings recently consented in the city that have so much of the same ethos as you're proposing, what do you think makes this building different to be attractive to new tenants stroke occupiers? So here's your marketing chance. CBRE and Cushman aren't on the call.
yeah, no, sure. So we have had some really good tenant interest. I mean, start with the obvious location and the way in which we've tried to make sure that St. Paul's and the church, etc., are all brought into the building. So there's a real sense of where you are throughout the building, and that simply is one of the important things for us. Very unusual to have a building with so much space around it, so it's not in an urban block with buildings quite close by, which is part of its island site characteristics. And no change foreseeable in any of its surroundings. So whatever you've got there is what is going to stay there. They've got the St. Paul's surrounding conservation area views, grids, etc. So I think it's with great location, a great aspect, great space around it, a really good story in terms of carbon and energy. I think we're giving, it's a fair crack at the pitch. We've had very good responses.
I can imagine.
The biggest thing for us, which we always know anyway, is to make sure that effectively for the tenant it's a new build building. So how can you guarantee the facade? Well, we will make sure that everything has been refixed, and we'll put the the facade is as new. All of the systems will be as new. So we're just making sure that, to all intents and purposes, it's a new building with a huge saving in terms of time and effort to get there.
New building on old bones, yeah?
A new building, old bones, very big floor plates. It's always good for organisations to have a little bit of back of house or support space. It's planned very, very easily. It's big floor plates for the city and its location.
Excellent. Okay. A couple more questions, just conscious of the time. John Spencer Hall, comment, great building and presentation. Newgate clearly exemplifies a lot of current trends for greenery, for reuse, and for active ground floor, and so on. Are you, as a shop, seeing similar trends internationally? And if so, how does Newgate compare? I guess that's some of your opening comments about New York stuff, but do you want to comment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think throughout the world, and I suppose everyone have to think really carefully now, but throughout the world there was a feeling that office buildings should not be closed at the base of the building, that there should be reasons to come in, and those reasons could also be informal workspace. So the F&B aspect of that is almost like an extended office, but it's something that also is projecting activity to its surroundings. And actually, in terms of security, there's longer for people to go up escalators and into lobbies and things. So even the tech companies are doing that. In China, they're really wanting to activate public realm, and they feel like they missed that out of their first generation of buildings. So we have looked at lots of different versions of retail on that ground floor, from one big unit to many small, and obviously retail now in an even harder place than it is. So there's a discussion there, but still ways of activating. We, again, in the cities we work in, whether it's Singapore, Tokyo, New York, San Francisco, they all have roof garden policies. And the idea that the roofs are for people and are a fantastic amenity, and you can pop up there to have a sandwich, I think is a very good one, and is embraced. The idea of blurring the inside to the outside, I think, is also firmly established in many places. So there's, I think, quite a good set of things that are common. Clearly on the continent, floor plate depths are very much more policed or sensitive. But otherwise, I mean, and we're doing some work in Düsseldorf and Berlin and various places, so we are very aware of maybe their net step in regulations. I mean, I think they used to be a long way ahead, then not now. But, there's no real difference, but there's still an openness to wider comfort range and various other things, which is useful. So quite a lot of synergies. Whether there's any of those are substantially rethought, I guess retail is the one that people are most concerned about. What will activity at the base of the building be? And almost, we have one project where people are almost talking about, well, maybe that becomes almost like an affordable workspace, or a subsidized workspace, or something that is more easily accessible, but has another version of making the building itself a little bit more inclusive or accessible. And then I suppose the other thing to say is, in most cities, the idea that one type of discipline is here and another is there has disappeared, as it has in London. So this is the idea you're relevant to not only a city institution, but someone who might find this location convenient and good and want to be in town on a broader spectrum. I think that's important. So we try and look at testing it for a wider range of users than its location would suggest.
Great, thank you. Final question, Bradley Baker. Only Bradley Baker could have the sheer balls to ask this, but we'll give him the pleasure. Great presentation, John. Without giving away any big secrets, which sectors from the occupier community is the building appealing to in particular? As if he doesn't know.
Yeah, all the bright ones, I would say.
Yeah.
all the highly educated bright ones.
No supplementaries from Bradley. John, that's been brilliant. Thank you very much for sharing, and obviously Orion and Pella as well for allowing us to kind of see their philosophy. Been a great show, so thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Just a reminder that we're taking a bit of a holiday, although nobody seems to be able to travel. Our next lecture is on the 11th of August with Frank Filsko from Make, and that is all about 20 Ropemaker Street, which is the project up by the HAC, where they've got a great pre-let. In fact, I think probably the biggest pre-let for the city this year to Linklaters. So without further ado, thank you everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.